Welcome on the record. And the
Hi,
record
Rodney.
today's Keith Wilkinson. Well done, Isle of Man, and
Hi.
my old stamping ground, which
Right,
that was in the good old TT days.
right.
And you were a medic actually then in the hospital. It
Yes.
must have been horrendous during TT week.
Yeah, it's usually horrendous in TT week. We normally have a few deaths and nasty injuries, but the last year, I think the last 2 years, there haven't been any deaths, which is excellent. But there's been a few nasty injuries over the years.
I bet there has. I mean, on the face of it, Keith, it's madness going round at those speeds. You've got dry stone walls everywhere. All right, you get the occasional straw bale, but for goodness sake, it's not surprising, is it, if things go badly wrong?
It is madness, because the roads are just like you'd imagine little country roads to be in England or anywhere really. They're just normal small roads,
Yeah,
narrow roads, surrounded by brick walls and trees and all kinds of obstacles. So if anyone crashes at the speeds they're going, the lap record now I think is 136 mile an hour. I think that's the record. That's the average speed. So they go like
exactly. I mean, if you take the top speed, wow.
yeah, the top speed's like 200 mile an hour.
Yeah.
Um, but when you drive around the course, um, you think it's a long journey. You're going around and it's 37 miles, yeah, just over. And then when you're watching the races, they're round again in like 16 minutes. They're doing like 4 or 5 or 6 laps, and they're round every 16, 17 minutes. They're back again. So it's hard to get your head around how fast they go. But I've always thought they're slightly mad, but I've always admired the courage, because they all know if they come off, it could be death or, a nasty injury, life-changing injury, head injury, spinal injury. So I can't understand I can't even ride a motorbike, so I can't understand how anyone can go that fast. But anyway,
Downhill, the moped downhill is equally dangerous. Now, look, medic, anaesthetist, consultant for donkey's years. And
I was the consultant for 30 years, and I started my career on the Isle of Man in 1982 after medical school. So I did 5 years then, and then I worked, did that 1 year here, and then I went back to Liverpool where I trained where I'd been to medical school, and then I'd started my anaesthetic training. So I had 4 years back there, 3 years in Newcastle, and then I came here in 1990 to start a consultant job, and I retired 5 years ago after exactly 30 years as a consultant. So
I've got
that's
quite a few pals that are actually gas men
right.
on the Great Line, and that's what they call themselves.
I do, yeah.
And having said that, you've got to be pretty well qualified. You are greatly respected within the profession.
Well, I mean, yeah, like all doctors, you do your medical school training, and then you have to it was 1 year job called a pre-registration job before you get on the full medical register. But now you have to do 2 years in kind of approved jobs. And then after that, you decide what you're going to do. So if you're going to be a GP, you go into GP training. That's what most doctors do. If you want to work in hospital medicine, whether you want to be a surgeon or a physician or a psychiatrist or whatever, then you go off and do all the training. And then you've got postgraduate exams you need to pass if you want to get to the top and be a consultant. So that's a kind of brief summary of medical training to be a consultant.
Now,
Um,
apart from that, Keith, you've had, well, some people might say it's a bit macabre because from the age of 9, you've been in,
well, I guess it was about 9 or 10, definitely 10. I'm sorry, you're going to mention my true crime interest.
absolutely. I mean, it's not normal at that age to go into the criminal and the hard
Yeah,
line criminal.
I think it started with my dad used to get books from the local library in the village near Durham, where we lived. And he had an interest in true crime. Not just that, he had an interest in books about the war and about uh, mountaineering. That was another thing he was fascinated by. But basically, I used to read his true crime books after he'd finished with them. I started reading them, and I also started reading the Daily Mirror, which we used to have delivered every day. and any crime, but any murder trials that were going on, I started to read, to follow them, and on the news, I remember a murder in 1965, so I'd have been 9 then. And it was on Panic Chase. It was a horrible child. 3 girls were murdered. And that when the Moors murders, that was around that time, 1965. So I remember following all those on the news, 6 o'clock news, and in the newspapers. So that's how it all started, and it's gone on since then. So that's like 55 years or so. I've been reading true crime books. And then when I went off to medical school, I used to go to some of the trials at the court in Liverpool instead of going to instead of going into hospital and doing what I was supposed to be doing. I'd sneak off to the trials. And then even now I go to the Old Bailey every few months. And I've been to Lewes Crown Court and Newcastle and Liverpool Crown Courts. And so it's a lifelong interest, really. Not just murders, true crime, forensics, anything to do with true crime, really. I think I would have been a barrister or tried to be a barrister if I hadn't become a doctor. That was my second choice.
Right. And listen, you've written books as well about this lot.
I've only written 2 books. One was called Manx Murders. That's about murders on the Isle of Man over a 150-year period. And I wrote that was 2003. And then the only other book was about my career. Just before I retired, I started to write that book. And that's called If in Doubt. And it's an anaesthetist story. And it's just about how I got into medical school, a bit about the training, and just some interesting patients I helped look after. And that's the other book I wrote.
Are there more murders on the island per square metre?
No, there's very few on the island, fortunately. But over the last 150 years, there seems to be a lot, but that's over a long period, obviously. But it's very, very rare, fortunately, on the island.
Are they domestic or are they?
Well, it's not that interesting because it's well-known fact, but I think almost every one in the book, there's 21 cases, and almost every one involves alcohol. I think that's well known anyway, but they nearly all involve, drinking but a lot of them are domestic, but not all. We had a horrible one in 1978, a young girl was murdered. So not all domestic, but the vast majority are. There was someone in the family or someone known to the victim murdered them. Some of the cases some of them were unsolved. I think 3 are unsolved. Others were charged with murder but found guilty of manslaughter, and then the other ones were found guilty of murder. And some were sentenced to death. The death penalty here was abolished, I think, about 27 years after it was abolished in England, in the rest of Great Britain. So that's kind of an interesting point, because after it was abolished there were 1 or 2 men were sentenced to death on the island, but they weren't going to be executed. So they were automatically commuted to life imprisonment. But the last one on the island, I think, was 93. I think that was the last person who was sentenced to death. And then it was abolished on the island as well. So there was the penalty for murder now is life imprisonment, as it is in the rest of the UK. So
Has it made any difference to the number of murders abolishing the death sentence?
Well, it's hard to say. As I say, it's so rare anyway. I don't think we can say, but I mean, the death penalty in England was abolished in 1965, I think. I'm not sure about that, to be honest. It's a good question whether it actually made any difference in the UK. I don't think it did. Out of the incidence of murders. But I don't know the answer to that. I don't think on the island, because there were so few anyway.
Well, the island's very traditionally conservative, small c, and you go back to thinking of the birching days. They were a long time getting rid of that, weren't they?
They were. I think that I can't remember when that finished. I think that was. I did read about the last birching when I was researching the book. I think it was Uh, no, I can't remember. Late, I think it was 1980-ish, 81, I
It
think.
must have been. It must
It
have
was
been.
around then.
Mm.
There were three boys from I think from Liverpool, or from England anyway, came over and they got into a fight, and I think they got the birch. And I used to actually I've just remembered I used to drink with in the local pub with a man who was a retired police officer, and he used to give the birch, and he used to tell me some stories about. He used to tell me
Right.
some
I
stories
mean, did
about it.
that make any difference to the subsequent behavior of the young people, particularly?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, most people say that, and he said that definitely. But I don't know, to be honest.
Mm.
Um, It was pretty awful punishment, I think. It was painful, and it was,
I bet.
they did dread having it, So, but I don't know the answer, to be honest.
One day the truth will emerge. Now, I'm saying that because what we're really going to have a chat about today is Lucy Letby, because you've been following her case for a long time.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I said to someone last night, I feel a bit of a fraud, being invited to talk about it because I'm no expert on it. I'm just interested, like I have been all my life, in true crime, and because it was nursing, and these are doctors are involved, obviously, and patients, very, very young babies. It was natural, I suppose, I'd take an interest for those reasons. But I must admit, at the time of the trial, the first trial, I don't know why, I just never, it went on for 10 months, I think. It was a long trial. And
Mm.
I did follow, it wasn't that well reported in the newspapers. There was some days I looked and there was like nothing. So I didn't really follow it much. And just to be honest with you, I assumed that she was guilty. I just thought, this can't possibly have
Yeah, I think most people are the same. And
yeah,
before we go down in details on this one, I mean, we've got to set our stall out at the beginning and say we're in no way in a position here to decide whether she was guilty or not.
yeah, yes,
Maybe you'll never know. She knows. But was it a fair trial? Now, there's where the question marks start.
yes. Well, at the time, as I say, I wasn't following it that closely because I couldn't read. I did actually I emailed the court in Manchester, and I said, if I come over from the Isle of Man, uh, is there any chance at all of getting into the court or not? Because I knew there were so many victims, uh, both babies who were murdered and who she was accused of attempting to murder. I knew there'd be a lot of family members probably, and I think it's only a fairly small court. So I did email them to say, is there any point in coming over? And I think the next morning, straight away, they politely replied and said, there's no chance whatsoever of getting into the actual court. So, because it must have reserved seats, for those sort of people.
I was going to
But he
ask you
said,
this earlier on because you frequent the courts, and it's
yeah, I've been
just a
to,
question of turning up. You have to book yourself
yeah,
in.
I've been to a few courts, but because of it would be like a bit of a trek to get there from the Isle of Man, I thought I'll just check and see. And they did say you can't get into the court, that's definite. But we have like an overflow, or it's not an overflow, another courtroom with a live feed the actual court.
Right.
So they said if you queue up a little bit, you'll almost certainly get into that one. But I didn't really fancy that, sitting, not being in the actual courtroom.
No, you don't get the atmosphere, do you?
So I never went to the trial. That was another reason I was going to go, just to get an idea of what was going on. So basically, in answer to your question, um, I didn't, I couldn't really follow the trial that much anyway. So at the time, I couldn't say, whether she had a fair trial or not. But I suppose for the last, say, 18 months, 15 to 18 months, I've been following it as best I can online, reading trial transcripts, talking to other people who was, like-minded people. I went to a meeting in Hereford in June of people who feel she's innocent, nurses and doctors who all feel she's innocent. And basically, over that period of like a year and a half, I've come to the conclusion that there's no question at all that she didn't have a fair trial, for many reasons, and shocking, almost unbelievable reasons to me. I just can't. I still can't believe it's happened. That's what I honestly feel. It was. I put a few little comments on YouTube channels when I've just to say, I think personally from the start, she never stood a chance. Everything seemed to be stacked against her. That's my honest opinion.
I'm
For all the
thinking of what is happening today, and there have been several cases this last week surrounding jury trial, being allowed a jury trial, inverted commas, and you get off, plead guilty, and
Yeah,
guilty. Now, it's not quite like that, of course,
no,
it's a jury trial, but things are often done in back rooms, aren't they?
I think so. I mean, I just, I mean, people say to me, well, she had a long trial. She's had two appeals. She had a retrial. Um, and at the end of both those trials, she received life sentences. So the first time she got 14, not just life sentences, she got whole life sentences. So she's going to die in prison. And then this retrial, which was an attempted murder charge. This is another shocking thing to me. There was an attempted murder. So at the first trial, the jury couldn't agree on that one baby Kate. And for some reason, which I've never really understood, they decided to retry her. So she had a retrial in 2000 last year, 2024, and she was found guilty again, and she had another whole life sentence. So she got 15 whole life sentences. So that's another shocking thing to me because I may be wrong. I can't think of anyone since whole life sentences were brought in, which I think was 1983. I think I read, I had to check on that. So I think since 1983, that's the harshest punishment for murder in the UK.
Mm.
Before then, it was just a life sentence. It was the death penalty. Then it was a life sentence, and that life sentence could be anything from a few years up to a whole life sentence. But anyway, so she's got 15 whole life sentences. So firstly, I think, again, I may be wrong. I think that's the harshest punishment anyone in the UK has ever received since the death penalty was abolished. And the second thing is, in the retrial, and again, I've never heard anyone else say this, but I've never heard of anyone getting a whole life sentence for attempted murder. May get a life sentence, or you may get a few years in prison. So to me, she's had the harshest punishment of any murderer since the death penalty. I mean, you can't get any harsher than the death penalty. In all of the awful, horrific murders I've followed over the years, and some of which you'll have heard of, high profile, well publicized cases, her punishment is worse than all of them in terms of the number of whole life sentences.
Before we go into the foreground of this, let's go into the background because this has been going on for some years. And it's come out, of course, the three medics that were questioned by the police about any involvement in the running of that particular section of the hospital. This has been going on for years.
Well, the first, the murders that she's accused of happened over a 1 year period between, I think it was June 2015 and June 2000 or July 2016. I think that's right. It was a 12 or 13-month period. That's all the cases she was involved with. That she was being accused of murdering or attempting to murder. So, I mean, the first time I heard of anything at all happening in Chester, I remember I was in the operating theatre, and I think it was about 2018, I think. That's when she was first arrested. And that's when the news kind of broke. I remember I was in the theatre, I had a patient anaesthetised and they had the radio on. And I remember moving over the radio and thinking, hang on, what's this? And they said that a nurse in Chester, and I'm kind of even more interested, because I only spent a week there on my paediatric attachment as a medical student. So I went there for 1 week. We went to did paediatrics there, and I think we went into the neonatal unit once or twice just to have a quick look around. This was many years ago. That was 1980. But so anyway, I had a slight interest because it was near Liverpool, and I had been there for that week. But anyway, I didn't hear any more for a few months after that. And I think she was arrested again. And then the final time she was arrested, that was 2019. She was arrested, and I think November of that year. and then she was remanded. So she's been in custody since then. But the first trial didn't happen until 2023, and she was had the retrial in 2000 last year, 2024. So basically, it's been going on. The cases all happened between 2015 and 2016, but there's so much happened since then. It just seems to have been going on for years, and she's been in prison, in remanded in prison since for about 6 years now. But the trials only happened in 2023 and 2024. So, as you say, it's been going on for ages. The case is dragging on, and even now, the police, as you probably heard, arrested three managers. I think it was about 10 weeks ago, roughly, for questioning on suspicion of gross negligent manslaughter.
Yep.
And also, they put more cases to the CPS to basically see if they are going to give the police permission to charge her for more assaults on babies. While she was both at Chester and at the Women's Hospital in Liverpool. She was there as a student, I think 2012, I think that was.
This is odd because there were no
Well,
actual deaths they could pin on her. Oh, the hospital now in Liverpool.
well, yeah, the Women's Hospital, what they're doing is basically, I think at the Thirlwall inquiry, which was a big public inquiry in Liverpool, I went to a little bit of it in the town hall there. That went on for quite a few months. And I think the results of that are going to be published. I think it's January next year now. They were supposed to come out in the next month or two, but it's been put back a bit. So it's at that inquiry, one of the consultants, I don't know why he said this, but he did say that he felt there was probably more deaths before the ones between that period of 2015 to 16. So I'm not sure whether that had anything to do with it, but the police then started looking back at her employment before that period. And now they've come up and said that they're kind of concerned about cases. And as I say, the CPS have got more information to suggest that she may have committed more crimes. So those two things have happened.
Keith, in all this, we've got no smoking gun.
Well, I don't think there's any smoking gun. I don't think there's any evidence that any baby was deliberately harmed. That's what I honestly feel. But people think, oh, the smoking gun was the insulin, the two insulin cases.
Yes.
Now, there was a documentary on a few nights ago, Panorama, and then there was an ITV documentary on
Yes, I saw that.
2 weeks ago. And I watched both of them, obviously, but it's hard to summarize it, the insulin cases, but my feeling is there's no evidence whatsoever that any baby had insulin poisoning. That's what she was found guilty of attempting to murder those babies. But on the Panorama documentary, or just a few nights ago, Judith Moritz and Jonathan Coffey, they found, I think, just one, I think it was an endocrinologist who felt that he did believe that the results that they got, the blood results, show that the babies were given insulin, whether deliberately or accidentally or whatever. He said that's the only explanation. But there's a lot of other experts, like real experts, who disagree with that. And that, as you probably know, her barrister has sent a file to the CCRC. And in that file, many experts have said that they disagree with the findings about the
Now
incident.
we're talking about experts in all this, and one has to say that there are some pretty weighty people that are saying and questioning the whole thing from all over the world. It's most peculiar.
It's definitely, well, I think it's unprecedented. I've never heard of this before. The other interesting thing is Mark MacDonald. I only realized this recently. Mark MacDonald is doing all his work for free, and all the experts, every single one of them, has never asked for any money. They're all doing it for nothing. They don't want any payment, and they're not trying to show off or trying to make a name for themselves. They've already done that. They've got good reputations. They don't need they don't need to risk those reputations to me either, because if she suddenly comes out, this, can you imagine if this happens? One day she suddenly says, I can't stand this anymore. I've got to get off my chest. I actually did murder them. Can you imagine? People are going to laugh at them and say, hang on, you put your reputation on the line for her, and you've told everybody that you're convinced she's innocent, or you not maybe not convinced, but you really feel she's innocent. She's admitted she did it now. You know what I mean? They're going to be, it's going to be embarrassing, and I'm sure they will get a bit of maybe not ridicule, but you know what I'm saying. They're going to wish they'd never got involved.
Well,
But
there are MPs now involved and growing,
yeah,
don't they?
David Davies has put his head on the chopping block as well. And I think other people have stepped in as well. So for them to do that, it's kind of like, why would you do that unless you honestly believe it?
Yeah.
And they believe it, not because they just kind of think, oh, I'll jump on the bandwagon and just kind of, she may be innocent, so I'll put my two pence in. It's not about that. They really think like I do, that they can't believe how it's happened. And it could be their daughters, or it could be one of my three daughters. They could be in prison for the rest of their lives, at risk of attack from other prisoners, because I imagine she won't be very popular if they think she's killed little babies. So her life's ruined. Her parents' life, I would imagine, I dread to think what they're going through. And her friends, I don't think they didn't have any other children or parents. So it's just a horrific situation all around for everyone.
The other big question mark I'm thinking about is there were plenty of experts for the prosecution side,
Yeah.
and there were none on her side.
Well, there was seven, I think there was seven for the prosecution. There was an endocrinologist professor, retired professor, who coincidentally was in my year at medical school. I actually messaged her later on. But there was a radiologist, so they're X-ray doctors. They look at X-rays and scans. And then there's a pathologist, and then of course there were the main two, who was Dr. Evans. I think I don't know how to pronounce his name, whether it's Dowie or Dewey Evans, who's Welsh. And he's a retired paediatrician. And then there was Sandy Bohin, who was she was a paediatrician from, I think, Guernsey. So they were the main two, Dr. Evans and Dr. Bowen. So they were you say experts for the prosecution, and you're right. But another thing, you're not supposed to be, you're supposed to be, what's the word? Like unbiased. You're called in by, either side can call you in, and then you just give your honest opinion. You're not supposed to be trying to convince the jury she's guilty. You just give your opinion as an expert, and it's up to them to decide. So you answer the questions from the lawyers, and as best you can, you answer them truthfully, and then you leave it. You should leave it at that, really. But there is a feel, and one of my feeling is that they were kind of working almost for the prosecution to build as good a case for the prosecution. The defense lawyer was there for a lot of the trial, if not all the trial, but he was never called. And that's one of the big mysteries. A lot of people ask that question: why wasn't he called? And I don't know what the answer is. People are still talking about this now. Why wasn't he, Dr. Hall? He was convinced she was innocent, I think, or at least, fairly sure she was innocent. Excuse me. But he sat there waiting to give evidence and was never called. So that's a mystery.
It is now, in all this, Keith, who had or is in a position to lose most or gain most should the truth, whatever the truth is, come out?
Well,
Why would the establishment, let's christen it, want to keep it quiet and pin it on somebody? One can only assume that they know who's guilty and had to swing it away, and she took the rap.
Well, again, a good question, and I can't really answer it, but I think if I was one of the senior police officers in charge of the inquiry, I would be certainly lying awake at night thinking, if she's innocent, are they going to come, and criticize me for what I did? If I was a senior manager, I would think the same. If I was one of the doctors who accused it, there wasn't just three, there was seven doctors who she took a grievance out against. I don't know whether you're aware of this, but she basically, two of the doctors in particular, as far as I can gather, felt, and I'm not really criticizing. They honestly believed, I think, that there was an increase in the number of deaths over a fairly short period, and they got it into their heads that she was possibly involved. I think that's how it started. I'm assuming, having worked in intensive care units for many years, I think they must have talked to each other, and maybe I'm just guessing. Maybe one said, Lucy seems to have been around for a lot of these cases. So I think there was a kind of initial, what's the word? They started to think about it, and then it became. Then there's a few more deaths or sudden collapses, not just deaths, sudden collapses of babies who they said they didn't expect to have a sudden collapse. And then it started that they believed that maybe Lucy was involved. And I think I kind of put myself in their position all the time because I was a consultant. And I would have gone to the senior nurses and maybe the medical director eventually. And I would have, thought about it, and because it's a difficult situation, you can't imagine how you would deal with it personally if you were one of those consultants. But I think that's how it started. So eventually they kind of insisted, especially, they tried to get the senior managers, senior nurses to remove Lucy from the unit. And that eventually happened, and she was devastated when that happened because I think she'd been on holiday and she was about to come back to work, and they knew that. So just before that happened, they managed to get the managers, I think I'm correct in saying this, the senior managers, senior nurses, to have her removed from the unit. So they moved her into a sort of desk job, and she was like devastated when that happened. And then after that, again, I don't know the exact sequence of events, but I know that she took a grievance out a few months later. So she went into the grievance procedure, and Dr. Green, who was in charge of the pharmacy. So they tried to get an independent person, obviously, to look at her claims of, and to speak to the people who she's took the grievance out against. And in all my 38 years as a doctor and 37 years working as an anaesthetist, 30 as a consultant, I've never heard of any nurse actually taking a grievance out against a doctor. That's the truth. I've never heard of it.
Mm.
But anyway, she took the grievance out against seven, and not just doctors, they were all consultants. But this is the shocking thing. She won. She won the grievance against all seven. So that was going on. She won the grievance. And the Dr. Green, who had investigated her grievance, had said, I have seen his report, and he said he felt the behavior of some of the doctors he was disgusted by their behavior. That was one thing he said. And another thing, he kind of hinted that he suspected whether they'd been truthful. That was another thing he said. So basically, she won the grievance, which incidentally, the jury at her trial weren't allowed to hear. The judge decided that I don't know why, but the judge had said that they weren't allowed to hear that fact. So the jury weren't aware that the doctors may have, I'm not saying they did, but maybe they had a kind of grudge against her, because she'd won a grievance against them for bullying, and kind of hinting that she might be a murderer. So that was what grievance was about. And they'd had her removed from the unit. If she's innocent and she's been arrested, she's never been in trouble in her life, like my three daughters, for example, and I just imagine one of them, they're a nurse doing a great job. All the friends love her. She's well respected. The parents love her. She looks after all the sickest babies because she's got extra qualifications to do that. She's always doing extra shifts because if someone goes off sick, a bit like I was, if someone said to me, someone's off sick, can you come and do the night on course? I'd do anything. Not for money. You don't want any more money
No,
to
no.
do it. So she was like that. So she was just a normal, excellent, well-liked nurse. So the next thing, she gets she hears the talking about and calling her a possible murderer. She hears these other people must come. I'm just imagining people come to her and say, "Oh, I heard so and so saying they think you might have harmed that baby." So the next thing, she gets kicked off the unit. She goes in some awful desk job in the complaints office, and she gets seen every week by a senior nurse. And the nurse who saw her, she's come out now and said she's convinced she's innocent. But every time she saw her, she said she's crying her eyes out. She said it was like harrowing. That's the word she used. She actually kept in touch with them, kept saying, "Look, we've all got your back. We're all behind you. It'll all be fine. You'll come back soon. We all believe that you've done nothing wrong." And she'd give her a hug and she'd crying her eyes out. And Lucy would say, "Why is this happening to me? I've done nothing wrong. Anyway, all that was going on. And then the next thing, she gets arrested, not once, 3 times. So after the first one, she gets let out. She must know they're looking for more information to nail her. Then she gets arrested again. And then I think 18 months after the first arrest, she gets arrested for the final time. And that time, that's it then. She gets charged. So how do you expect her to bloody behave, when so the next thing, the police question her, and there's bits of it online, you can see it on YouTube. And she's sitting there and she's asking the questions and she says, I can't remember. And they say, and they're asking, she's dead polite and nice. There's none of this like no comment, like some people say, every single question you get, no comment, no comment. She's trying to be helpful and she's doing all the things that one of my daughters would do. She's like naive, trusting, honest. Do you know what I mean? Trying to be helpful because she naively thinks it's all going to go away and they'll see that it's all a big mistake and she'll get out. But what's wrong with that? That's what innocent people do. To me, it's so obvious. But they're saying, "Oh no, why didn't she refuse to answer? Or why did she keep saying I've forgotten?" Well, she had forgotten. It happened years before, and she didn't think it was a big deal at the time. Baby collapses. Well, loads of babies collapse. She can't remember that specific one. Do you know what I'm saying? So to me, it's all like honest. Everything she's done has been like honest behavior. And then when she went in the witness box, which most guilty people don't do, they think, God, they're going to crucify, the lawyers probably say, "Oh, if I was you, we don't have to prove you're innocent. They have to convince the jury you're guilty. We don't have to say anything." But anyway, she did go in and she was in, I think, 10 days getting grilled by bloody Johnson, the horrible prosecutor, bullying her. And so at one point he said, "Do you accept that these babies were poisoned? We're given insulin because these experts say that's the case." And she said, "Well, if that's what they say, it must. So do you agree that it happened?" "Yes, if that's what they say." Now that's again, that's like an innocent person. If I can't go against these experts. If they say the babies were poisoned, then yes, they were. But she didn't do it. But she says if they were poisoned, well, that must be. So people are blaming her for that now. Well, what the hell is she going to say? "Oh no, I'm an expert in insulin. I know. I don't believe this machine. This is not a very good test. You have to retest and get the." She doesn't know all that. She's just said, "Well, if that's what they say, it must have been poison." So you get a baby in the Countess of Chester who would be like premature, on a ventilator, not very well, really. The consultant might not have seen them for 2 days. They had like junior doctors looking after them. But they did 2 ward rounds, that's a fact, 2 ward rounds a week. Now, how can you honestly say, "We've got a fantastic unit here, we've got our finger on the pulse, we know what's going on with these babies, we're talking to families all the time, the parents, the nurses, we're all a great team doing a fantastic job." Hang on, you're only here bloody twice a week doing your ward round. How the hell can there be any proper plans made as to what's going to happen in the next 12 hours? You know what I mean? That's how crap the unit was. So that's a little bit about the background that was going on. So if I was one of those doctors, to get back to your point, I think I'd be a bit worried as well, in case she was found eventually exonerated, that I'd ruined her life. She'd been in prison for years, and it was partly due to me. If I was a doctor, I would be devastated, if I'd done that. So the doctors, the police, I think not that I'm a barrister or a lawyer, but the way the prosecution barrister treated Lucy when she went into the to give evidence herself. She was in for many days, and some of the testimony that I heard about, he was very hard on her, which you might say, well, he would be, he's a prosecutor. But I think some of the things he said to her were uncalled for, and I think you could call it bullying. I think that's just my opinion. Some of the things he said were awful and not really relevant to the. I mean, just one little thing I remember reading. She said something like she couldn't remember. Now, I believed it because I don't think she was actually there when this incident happened. And he said something like, "Do you remember being born?"
Yeah.
And she said, like, no, like no one remembers being born. But in other words, he was saying, well, it could have happened though. It did happen. You're born and you can't remember it. So this could have happened and you didn't remember it, which is absolutely ridiculous thing to say. So that's not a big issue, but to say there was far worse things than that. But that's just one little example. So she was given a hard time by him. And if I was him, I'd be slightly worried. The judge himself, some feel the judge was biased against her. So he might not feel very good. The appeal court judges who refuse her appeal, they might think, oh God, we refused her appeal and, she's been in prison all these years. So there's many people who might, if they've got a conscience, might feel bad that they've made mistakes. But I'll tell you just another little thing that I've been thinking, and I don't think it's going to happen. Or not just me, if any doctor with a conscience was involved with this and believed at first that she was guilty, and then it all spiraled out of control. The next thing she gets arrested, she gets charged, gets found guilty. If it was me, I think I would have to say, look, this might be the end of my career, but I think I'm going to have to just I've changed my mind. I think I've made a mistake. And I think if one of them went to Mark MacDonald, her barrister, and said, look, I'm fairly sure now I've made a mistake. I've got it all wrong. We honestly thought she was guilty. And we were pleased when she got found. She was guilty then. We were pleased when she was found guilty and given her whole life sentences. But now, having looked into more detail and, heard from experts, I think maybe we've got it wrong. Now, if that ever happened, I don't think it will. If that happened, that would blow the case wide open, obviously.
Keith, there's a lot of odd in all this.
Yeah.
One of the biggest odds, of course, is that why wasn't it picked up so much earlier? What about the first baby, the second baby? Well,
that's another thing. Another point. That's a good point. It wasn't picked up. It wouldn't be picked up with the first one. But I mean, if there was a few, I mean, I can't prove this, but I've heard there were spikes. They call them spike. A sudden, relatively over a short period of time, an increase in the expected number of deaths and sudden collapses. That's what they call a spike. There were spikes in other hospitals around that time, and probably at all times, there's sudden, you have a few deaths one after the other, and you just think that's the way it goes, and all these deaths obviously are looked into, you have the pathologists, coroners, they all investigate these deaths, and try to find out why they happened. But I think none of as far as I'm aware, none of the pathologists, I think 6 of the 7 babies who died had postmortems. None of the pathologists who were involved had any concerns there was any deliberate harm to anything. The coroner certainly didn't. In fact, the coroner at the Thirlwall inquiry, I can't remember his exact words, but one word was horrified. He was horrified that he wasn't aware there was any suspicions. And I think he said, what he did say, words to the effect that if he had known that doctors were suspicious that there was some deliberate harm going on, he said, I think I would have called in the police.
Yeah.
So, as you say, all these people didn't have concerns. They just thought it was just one of those unfortunate things that happen. You do get these spikes in deaths. But it went from no suspicions, to now going back to 2012, going back even further, looking for evidence that she might have harmed other babies before any of the ones at the campus of Chester happened. So, and when you think another thing, this police inquiry, it's going on now. It's been going on since 2017, I think. And now they're still investigating deaths, at the women's, and and it must have cost, I'd read to think what it's all cost. So I just don't know where it's all going to end, but I hope it ends as quickly as possible. One way, we get to the truth. And if she's innocent, which I think she is, and many people think she is, that she's released as soon as possible because, she's her life's flying by, and at the moment she's got no hope at all of release. And she knows if things don't change, she's going to die in prison. That could be in another 50 years' time.
Finally,
So
Keith, in all this, there's three words that keep coming back to me, and that is without reasonable doubt.
exactly.
Wow. You can't avoid that one.
No, I mean, you said the smoking gun before, and that's what people thought. Maybe the incident cases are the smoking gun. In fact, I think Dr. Breary, I think he might have said that when he realised. He said, "Oh, this might be the smoking gun. We might have got some definite proof that she did this." And the jury, they obviously felt that was important because they were the first verdicts that came back in the first trial, the incident cases. And then that one, I think, has been completely annihilated, that case. That's what I think, personally. But the other case, in all the cases, whether it was supposed air embolism, that's air injected into the venous system through an IV line of drip, or whether there was deliberate forcing of air down the nasogastric tube into the stomach to fill the stomach up, or deliberately overfeeding with milk down the nasogastric tube to fill the stomach up and push the diaphragm up so the baby couldn't breathe. I mean, that's the most ridiculous suggestion of all. I don't think it could possibly kill a baby doing that. But anyway, that was another theory. So they were the four main theories were air embolism, causing sudden death or collapse, air down the nasogastric tube, with or without excess milk down the nasogastric tube. And then there were then the insulin cases. And the other one, in one case, I think, with deliberate trauma to the liver. So I'm not sure whether it was said in court, but the suggestion was that Lucy had deliberately, I don't know whether they meant she punched the baby or she deliberately injured the baby so that the liver was damaged. So they were the theories of how these deaths occurred. And in all of those theories, I mean, that's another strange thing. Why wouldn't anyone come out with all these different methods of murder? Why not just stick to one? But anyway, no one, even the prosecution, had to accept that no one ever saw her do anything that was concerning. They never saw her trying to hide a syringe that she just used to inject air. They never saw her fiddling with an insulin vial, or taking an insulin vial and was stopped and said, what have you got that for? They never saw her squirting milk down the nasogastric tubes or deliberately harming a baby. On the contrary, she was known to put a lot of Datex forms in. In other words, if someone made a little mistake, including her, she'd put a form in. So that would be later investigated and we might learn from it. So the suggestion that she actually harmed all these babies without anyone in a fairly small unit when they're working close to each other saw her do anything is also ridiculous, to me. So I don't know. I just, as I say, but you're right when you say beyond reasonable doubt. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt personally, but at the trial, for various reasons, as I say, I don't think she stood a chance because the main reason she didn't stand a chance is because of the theories put forward by Dr. Evans, and because he came across in court, I believe, quite well, and that he was convinced this is what happened, and the jury believed him, and there was no one to refute that. As you say, there was no defense, no expert who spoke up for her and said that this was. Now, if the trial happened now, it would be the exact opposite. I don't believe they'd be able to find any prosecution experts, to be honest. I honestly, I can't imagine any doctor believing that she murdered babies in the ways that Dr. Evans said. I don't think anyone in the world would ever have said that if they'd asked them the first time round, So the prosecution would have a problem because I don't think they'd have any experts that would help their case. On the other side, the defense, they would have people queuing up to offer the defense for free. They're already waiting now, so they've already done the reports they've written the reports which have gone to the CCRC. So I don't see how there ever could be another trial personally, because it would just well, they could just arrange a trial, but on the first day, after the first few hours, I think the judge would say, hang on, this is just absolutely ridiculous. He wouldn't say that. He'd say it in legal terms. He would throw it out because he would think there's no case to answer. So that's my thoughts for what they're worth on that. But
well, it's been very interesting, Keith. We thank you for your experience in all this. And everybody from all sides must agree that it would be better finding out the truth earlier than later.
exactly. I mean, people say, oh, you shouldn't upset anyone that questions it shouldn't do that because you might upset the parents. But I don't know what the parents think because I don't know any of them, obviously. But I think if I was one of the parents, I would want to know the truth. That's it.
Mm.
And if the only way to get the truth, now that there's so many, I mean, a lot of them at first probably thought, or maybe they all thought that was the truth at the end of the first trial. But things have changed now. People have come forward and said they don't agree with what happened. They've got other opinions. As Mark McDonald's got all these experts have come forward. So if I was one of the family, I'd say, well, if we're not going to believe them, these are the best in the world, I think. When you hear some of these people talk, like Nina Modi, who was a professor of neonatology, when you hear them talking, you just, and you know that you can just tell, not because you're a doctor, like as I was, you can just tell that they're honest and they're knowledgeable, and if anyone is in a position to question the verdicts, they are surely, they're the best, they're the best. So the families must know that, and they must think, or I think they would think, well, if she's in prison, that could be one of their family, in prison for murder forever, and they're innocent. They wouldn't want that, surely. So I think the one word you've mentioned a few times, which I think is truth. That's what everyone wants. There's no point having her life ruined even more than it has been, and her poor parents, if she's innocent. And if she isn't innocent, then she needs to stay there, obviously. But so that's it in a nutshell. I think that's what my thoughts for what they're doing.
Truth at times can hurt. It's
Definitely.
a difficulty, but truth must emerge eventually.
It's a horrific situation to think that the family have been through all that. The babies died, or even just collapsed. They nearly died.
Mm.
And then they were told by the doctors that I'm assuming they were told, because there was no suggestion of any harm, being deliberate harm, that the babies died from natural causes. So that's bad enough. And then they were told there's a nurse being investigated. And then they find out that she's been found guilty of murder, or, causing these collapses. And that's all even worse. And then now they've been told that maybe she didn't do it and maybe it was natural causes. So they've been through a horrific time themselves, the parents. But at the end of the day, the truth's what matters, as you say, and that's what I think. And I just hope we get to the truth eventually, and that's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rodney.
The last time we meet, there's various things that you're into, let's say, that we're also interested in, and I'm sure it won't be long. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rodney.